He had been talking to the dead for 12 years. His last words to a living soul were spoken on that cursed night, but now 5 women knocking at his door would forever change Ezekiel Thornton's world of silence, because these women weren't ordinary fugitives, and what they carried with them would determine the fate of the entire Wild West. But what would truly shock you is who these women really were. Before that night, 12 years ago, Ezekiel Thornton had been a different man entirely. He'd been a railroad engineer, one of the best in the territory. His hands had built bridges that spanned impossible gorges, carved tunnels through mountains that older men said couldn't be tamed. He'd had a future, a purpose, and a wife who believed in his dreams. Mary had been the daughter of a preacher, but she'd fallen in love with a man who built pathways to tomorrow. She'd wait for him at the kitchen window of their little house in Copper Creek, watching for the dust cloud that meant Ezekiel was coming home. And when he'd ride up, covered in sweat and grime from another day of conquering the wilderness, she'd run out to meet him like he was a conquering hero. But that was before the night. Everything changed. Before the night Mary died screaming words in languages that didn't exist. Before Ezekiel discovered that some doors once open can never be closed again. The wind whistled through the tombstones like bullets through bone. Each note sounded like the voice in Ezekiel's head, like his wife's last breath. When he came here 12 years ago, he thought the silence of the dead would heal him. He was wrong. The silence had only made the pain grow louder. Mary's death night haunted him still. What happened in the house that night wasn't normal. Mary's body burned with fever, but she had no temperature. Her eyes changed from black to white, and she spoke, but not in her own voice, as if someone else was inside her. But what Ezekiel had never told anyone was what happened in the hours before Mary died. It started with the dreams. For 3 weeks, Mary had been waking up screaming about things that were impossible. She talked about walking through underground tunnels filled with bones, about voices calling her name from beneath the earth, about a great door that was slowly creaking open. "Ezekiel," she'd whispered that final morning, her hand trembling as she poured his coffee. "They're getting stronger. The voices, they know I can hear them now." He'd thought it was just nightmares brought on by the fever. How could he have known that his wife was being called by forces older than the mountains he'd carved his tunnels through? That final night, Mary had suddenly sat up in bed at exactly midnight. Her eyes were wide open, but she wasn't seeing their bedroom. She was seeing something else entirely. "The door," she'd said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "The door is opening, Ezekiel. And once it opens all the way, nothing will ever be the same." "They came," she had said with her last breath. "They're coming from under the ground. And now the door is open." He had never told those words to anyone, because who would believe it? But now, 12 years later, it was time to learn what those words meant. He sat by his fireplace in the small church cottage, turning through pages of a 300-year-old Bible. The pages had handwritten notes in Latin, ancient Hebrew, and languages he'd never recognized. The book itself was a mystery. When Ezekiel had first arrived at Thunder Gap, the previous caretaker, an ancient man named Jeremiah Crowfoot, had pressed it into his hands with shaking fingers. "This book," the old man had wheezed, "has been here longer than the town, longer than the territory, maybe longer than the country itself. The notes, they write themselves. Boy, and they write the future." Ezekiel had thought the old man was losing his mind. But then Jeremiah had opened to a specific page and pointed to a line written in English. "The railroad man will come when his heart is broken. He will tend the dead until the door opens again." That had been written long before Ezekiel was born, long before he'd ever met Mary, long before he'd ever seen Thunder Gap. In recent months, he'd noticed that the notes were changing, as if someone came at night, writing new things. But tonight the opened page was different. "When the 5 sisters come, open the door, because what they bring is what you seek." And underneath, in fresh ink that hadn't been there yesterday, "The Black Hand approaches. Tonight the real war begins." The knocking on the door tore him from his thoughts. No one had come for 12 years. Even townspeople feared Thunder Gap Graveyard, preferring to bury their dead elsewhere. Strange things happened here at night. The door was knocked again, this time stronger, more determined. "Open the door, Mr. Thornton." The voice echoed through the walls, a woman's voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "We know you're expecting us, but what would truly shock you would be this woman's next words." Ezekiel's blood froze. How did they know his name? And more importantly, how did they know he was expecting them? But then he looked at that book. The open page he'd seen in his dream last night. When the 5 sisters come, open the door, because what they bring is what you seek. I don't know who you are, he said toward the door, but this is sacred ground. I can't help you. A laugh rose from behind the door, like the laugh of someone 1,000 years old. Sacred ground, said the voice. Mr. Thornton, if you knew what lies beneath these lands, you would never use the word sacred again. What do you know? We know how Mary Elizabeth Thornton really died. The world stopped. Mary, his wife, she died 12 years ago. But what this woman knew would turn Ezekiel's world upside down. His memory took him to that night. Mary had suddenly fallen ill, but not like any illness, as if another being was trying to emerge from inside her. Her voice changed, sometimes like an old woman, sometimes inhuman. Ezekiel, she had said, her voice metallic. This isn't mine. This is their voice. They're calling me from under the ground. Then her eyes changed from black to completely white, as if light burned inside them. After Mary died, he couldn't return to the house. He came to the graveyard and waited by her grave. But Mary's grave was always different. Sometimes flowers grew by themselves. Sometimes the stone was warm, and sometimes sounds came from underneath. He opened the door. The sight before him was extraordinary. 5 women stood at his door, but these weren't ordinary women. Their true identity was shocking enough to freeze Ezekiel. The oldest, perhaps 60, had silver hair and impossibly blue eyes. She wore nun's robes from an unknown order. The cross was inverted, covered in strange symbols. Beside her stood 4 younger women of indeterminate age. They could be 20 or 200 years old. All wore black dresses and held glowing stones. I am Sister Isabella, said the old woman. We came to talk to you, Mr. Thornton, because Mary's death was a beginning, and now it's time for the end. Ezekiel stepped back. What does Mary's death have to do with you? Isabella smiled coldly. We killed her, Mr. Thornton, but for a good reason, because Mary was one of us, and her power was about to awaken. But the explanation that would come next would blow Ezekiel's mind. The power to manage the boundary between life and death. This graveyard isn't just burial ground, Ezekiel. It's a door between the world of the living and the dead. Isabella's eyes sparkled. Mary was the key to that door. The key? Yes. Our lineage carries this power, protected for centuries. Mary was from our bloodline but didn't know it until her powers began awakening. Isabel looked out the window. Mary's death wasn't an accident. The uncontrolled power killed her. For 12 years your connection with it has grown stronger. Living here, waiting by her grave, all of this made you the new carrier. Isabella moved closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. But there's something else you need to know about Mary's death. Something we couldn't prevent, but something we've been trying to understand ever since. Ezekiel felt his stomach tighten. What? Mary didn't just die from the power awakening. She was murdered by the same organization that's hunting us now. The words hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. Murdered. The Black Hand Brotherhood has existed for over 300 years. They were founded by a man named Cornelius Blackmore in 1523. After he watched his family die from plague, he became obsessed with conquering death itself, but not to heal, to control. Over the centuries, they've hunted down every person with our abilities. Isabella's eyes grew dark with memory. They came to your house that night 12 years ago. Mary's powers were awakening, and they wanted to harvest them. But Mary was stronger than they expected. When they tried to drain her abilities, the power fought back. It killed her, but it also killed 3 of their best operatives. Ezekiel's hands began to shake. You're saying she died protecting you, Ezekiel, and protecting the power itself. Because if the Black Hand had successfully taken her abilities that night, they would have been one step closer to their ultimate goal, which is to resurrect an army of the dead and use them to rule the world of the living. Ezekiel looked at his hands. They seemed normal, but he remembered recent years' strange events. When he walked in the graveyard, tombstones trembled. Night sounds seemed to respond to him. Sometimes he talked to the dead in his dreams, but what was truly shocking was learning these dreams were real. But before he could process this revelation, sounds came from the distance. Horse hooves, shouts. Where are they? We tracked them here. Isabella's face hardened. The Black Hand Brotherhood. They've hunted us for 300 years because they know this graveyard's power can change the world's fate. What power? The power to resurrect the dead. Isabella pointed to one of her sisters who touched her stone to the ground. The nearest grave cracked open. From inside a hand emerged, then an arm. What climbed out had once been human but was no longer miners. Eyes glowing, body preserved, moving with purpose. This is just the beginning, Isabella said. There are 300 years of dead beneath these lands. All can be awakened. But what was truly terrifying was what these dead would be awakened for. The leader of the approaching forces dismounted his horse and strode toward the cottage with the confidence of a man who'd never known defeat. He was tall, imposing, with silver hair and cold gray eyes that seemed to pierce straight through a man's soul. This was the Waters Blackmore, great-great-grandson of the Brotherhood's founder, and he'd been hunting people with Ezekiel's abilities for over 40 years. Ezekiel Thornton. Blackmore's voice boomed across the graveyard. I know you're in there, and I know what you've become. Your wife died to keep this power from us, but tonight her sacrifice will be in vain. Isabella grabbed Ezekiel's arm. He's been tracking us for months. We led him here deliberately. What? Why? Because this is the one place where we're stronger than he is. This graveyard. It's not just any graveyard, Ezekiel. It's built on the site of an ancient battlefield. Thousands died here over the centuries. Indians, settlers, soldiers. Their spirits have been waiting for someone like you to give them purpose again. Blackmore continued his approach, flanked by a dozen armed men. But these weren't ordinary soldiers. They wore black uniforms with strange symbols, and their eyes held the dead look of men who'd seen too much darkness. These men, Isabella whispered, aren't fully human anymore. Blackmore has used stolen power to extend their lives, to make them stronger, faster, but it's cost them their souls. Ezekiel felt something stirring in his chest, a warmth that spread outward like ripples in a pond. What's happening to me? The power is responding to the threat. It knows what Blackmore represents. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, not with the approach of horses, but with something deeper, something that came from the earth itself. Horses approached through the storm. The leader, a tall man in a black cloak, called out, "Last time I'm saying this, surrender now or we'll kill you all." The Black Hand Brotherhood, Isabella whispered. Now it's time to choose, Mr. Thornton. Will you come with us and learn to control your power, or fall into their hands? Ezekiel shouldered his rifle. Lady, I've been a dead man for 12 years. Tonight I'm choosing to live again. What followed was unlike any battle ever fought in the American West. Isabella and her sisters moved like shadows given form, their ancient blades singing through the air with supernatural precision. But Blackmore's men weren't ordinary opponents. They fought with the strength of the undead and the cunning of those who'd sold their souls for power. The first wave came from 3 directions simultaneously. Ezekiel found himself facing opponents who moved too fast to be human, who shrugged off wounds that should have dropped them instantly. But every time one of them fell, the ground beneath Thunder Gap seemed to pulse with approval. You feel it, don't you? Isabella called out as she drove her blade through the heart of an attacker who barely flinched. The dead approve of what we're doing. She was right. With each enemy that fell, Ezekiel could feel the spirits beneath the ground stirring with something like satisfaction. These men had violated the natural order, and the dead wanted justice. But Blackmore himself had not yet entered the fight. He stood at the edge of the graveyard, chanting in a language that predated Latin, his hands glowing with stolen power. As his voice rose, the very air around them began to thicken with malevolent energy. He's trying to break the barriers, Isabella shouted. If he succeeds, he'll be able to command the dead here directly. Ezekiel felt panic rising in his chest. How do we stop him? You have to do what Mary couldn't. You have to fully accept the power. But accepting the power meant accepting that he would never again be the man he'd been. It meant embracing something that would forever separate him from ordinary humanity. The battle was swift and decisive. Isabella and her sisters moved like shadows, their blades finding targets with supernatural precision. When it was over, the Brotherhood lay defeated in the mud. But their victory brought new enemies. From the darkness came a voice of cold authority. This is Colonel Bradley, United States Army. You are surrounded. Surrender now, or we will burn you out. Isabella struck her stone to the ground. Brilliant light flooded the graveyard, revealing hundreds of ghostly figures surrounding the soldiers. The spirits of all who had been buried here for 3 centuries. Colonel Bradley. Isabella's voice echoed through the air. You and your men are not welcome on sacred ground. Leave this place, or face the wrath of the dead. The colonel's voice wavered. This is impossible. The only thing impossible, said Ezekiel, raising the stone skyward, is letting those who caused Mary's death go unpunished. The spirits moved as one. Invisible forces knocked soldiers from their horses, sent weapons flying. The army found themselves defenseless against hundreds of vengeful dead. But Ezekiel showed mercy. Go, he told the colonel, and never return. Next time, these spirits might not be so forgiving. The back door, the dynamite suddenly feeling like lead in his hands. Through the broken front entrance, torchlight flickered across the captain's body, and somewhere beyond that light, an innocent child was caught in the middle of a war that had nothing to do with them. Isabella grabbed his arm, her grip iron strong. It could be a trick. Soldiers have used such things before. But Ezekiel shook his head. He'd heard too many real cries in his life to mistake the genuine terror in that small voice. Someone out there, probably one of the captain's men, had brought their own child on what they'd expected to be a simple murder mission. We can't blow the dam, he said quietly. Not with a baby down there. Then we all die, one of the other women hissed. My daughter's life matters as much as that one. She was right, and Ezekiel knew it. But some lines, once crossed, changed a man forever. He'd been walking the edge of that line for 12 years. There's another way, he said, setting down the explosives. Harder, more dangerous, but it keeps everyone breathing. Isabella's eyes narrowed. Tell me. We make them think we're trapped. Make them overconfident. They'll send men to flush us out while the rest stay back with the horses. He paused. And whoever brought that baby, that leaves us outnumbered 3-1. In a fair fight, yes, but this won't be fair. Ezekiel moved to another cabinet, containing items that spoke to a different kind of warfare. Caltrops, iron spikes designed to lame horses, tripwires that could break a man's neck in the dark, bear traps that had never seen a bear. 12 years ago, I turned this place into a fortress because I was afraid of dying. Tonight we're going to use those defenses to make sure other people live. Outside, the voices were organizing. Someone was taking command, probably the captain's second. Orders were being given, positions assigned. They had numbers and training, but they were operating in the dark on ground. Ezekiel knew like his own heartbeat. How do we divide them, Isabella asked. We give them what they expect, a last stand. Barricade the front, make noise, make them think we're cornered and desperate. Half their force will come for us, the other half will stay back to secure the retreat route. And then Ezekiel smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Then we show them the difference between hunting frightened women and fighting people who've got nothing left to lose. The plan was simple, brutal, and completely insane. Isabella and 4 women would create a distraction at the front of the house, making enough noise to draw the assault team. Meanwhile, Ezekiel and the remaining women would circle around through terrain only he knew, targeting the reserve force and hopefully getting that baby to safety. If this goes wrong, Isabella said as they prepared to split up, the captain's death will mean nothing. They will paint us as savage murderers and use our bodies to justify 10 more raids. And if we do nothing, Ezekiel replied, that baby out there dies for its father's crimes, and you all die for the crime of wanting to live. Sometimes the only choice is between bad and worse. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Move, he whispered. As Isabella and her team took positions at the front of the house, Ezekiel led the others into the storm through his back door. The rain was lighter now, but the ground was treacherous, and one mistake would alert the soldiers to their flanking maneuver. The baby's cries were coming from a wagon positioned between the house and the soldiers' main camp. As Ezekiel crept closer through the mud and darkness, he could make out the shape of a military supply cart, and beside it, a woman hunched over something small and moving. Not a soldier's wife. This woman wore the rough clothes of a camp follower, probably a laundress or cook who'd been forced to bring her child on what should have been a simple mission. Ezekiel signaled for the women with him to hold position while he moved closer. Through the rain, he could hear the woman's desperate whispers as she tried to calm the crying infant. She was trapped between 2 forces about to collide, with nowhere to run and no way to protect her child from what was coming. From the house came the sound of Isabella's distraction. Gunshots, shouting. the crash of furniture being overturned. It was working. Through the darkness, Ezekiel could see soldiers moving toward the house, leaving the supply area lightly guarded. Rising from cover, Ezekiel walked directly toward the wagon, his rifle held low but ready. The nearest guard spotted him immediately, raising his weapon, but Ezekiel called out in a voice that carried calm authority. "Easy, soldier. Lieutenant Morrison sent me to secure the civilians." The lie bought him precious seconds. In the darkness and chaos, wearing his dark coat, he could pass for military at a distance. By the time the guard realized his mistake, Ezekiel was close enough that shouting would bring attention neither of them wanted. "You're not army," the soldier said, but his voice held uncertainty rather than alarm. "No," Ezekiel agreed, and struck the man across the temple with his rifle butt. The soldier dropped silently into the mud. The woman with the baby looked up as Ezekiel approached, terror bright in her eyes. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 19, with the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much hardship for her years. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt my baby. She's done nothing wrong." "Neither have you," Ezekiel said quietly. "What's your name?" "Mary Hendricks. I cook for the men, do their washing. Captain Morrison said it would be safe, said we were just going to arrest some women who'd stolen horses." Ezekiel felt anger burn in his chest. The captain had lied to his own people, turned a cook and her baby into unwitting accessories to murder. "Mary, I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" She nodded frantically, clutching her baby closer. "There's going to be more shooting in a minute. When it starts, you run toward that grove of trees and keep running until you can't hear the guns anymore. Follow the creek downstream. It leads to a trading post about 5 miles south. Tell them Ezekiel Redmond sent you." "What about you?" she asked. Before Ezekiel could answer, the remaining guards spotted him. One shouted a warning, while the other raised his rifle. But the women Ezekiel had left in position were already moving, emerging from the darkness like vengeful spirits. The fight was brief and decisive. These soldiers had expected to face frightened refugees, not experienced warriors who'd been planning their revenge for days. Within minutes, the supply area was secure, and Mary Hendricks was running into the night with her baby, disappearing into the safety of the storm. But their victory was short-lived. From the direction of the house came a new sound, not gunfire, but something worse, silence. Either Isabella's group had won completely, or they were all dead. And rising above the dying storm, a new voice called out with cold authority. "This is Colonel Bradley, United States Army. You are surrounded by a full company of soldiers. Surrender now, or we will burn you out and hang the survivors." Ezekiel felt his blood turn to ice. The captain hadn't been the real leader after all. Somewhere in the darkness, a much more dangerous enemy had been watching, waiting, letting others do the dying while he positioned his forces for the killing blow. But Isabella made an unexpected move. She struck her stone to the ground and a powerful light covered the graveyard. In that light, figures began to appear around the horses. Ghosts. Hundreds of ghosts. "Colonel Bradley," Isabella's voice echoed in the air. "You and your men are not welcome on sacred ground. Leave this place or everyone who died here will become your enemy." The colonel's figure on horseback swayed, because what he saw wasn't normal. The transparent figures moving around the horses, the dead walking from their graves. This was impossible. "This is an illusion," he shouted. "Magic tricks. Men, advance." But the soldiers didn't move, because they could see it too. The hands and feet emerging from every grave in the cemetery. This was real and terrifying. Isabella looked at Ezekiel. "Now it's time to use your real power. These men will only stop with force, and your power is much greater than theirs." Colonel Bradley's voice carried the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Through the darkness, Ezekiel could see torches spreading out in a wide circle around his property. Not the dozen riders they'd originally faced, but what looked like a full military operation. But Isabella had called Ezekiel's true power, and when Ezekiel raised the stone to the sky, all the tombstones began to emit bright light. The light was so powerful that the night became bright as day, and in the light, the spirits of all the dead in the graveyard were visible. 300 years of dead, all standing beside Ezekiel. The black-cloaked man stepped back. This is impossible." "The only thing that's impossible for me," said Ezekiel, "is letting those who caused Mary's death go unpunished." And at that moment, the spirits in the graveyard moved. The Black Hand Brotherhood's men were knocked from their horses by invisible forces. Their weapons flew from their hands, and they found themselves defenseless in the middle of the graveyard, facing hundreds of spirits. But Ezekiel didn't kill them, because he had learned that true power wasn't in killing but in letting live. "Go," he said to the black-cloaked man, "and never dare to come here again, because next time these spirits might not be so merciful." The man in fear gathered his companions and they mounted their horses and rode away. When the graveyard returned to silence, Ezekiel turned to Isabella, but now they weren't alone around them. After Blackmore's defeat, all the spirits in the graveyard had become visible. Hundreds of spirits stood among the tombstones. Peaceful, calm. "Now what happens?" Ezekiel asked. "Now," said Isabella, "it's time to tell you your real mission. This graveyard is just the beginning. There are many such places in the world, and they all need to be protected." Isabella approached the window, looking at the first rays of dawn. "There are at least 12 such places in America, even more in Europe. These places maintain the balance between life and death. And the Black Hand Brotherhood, they're trying to take control of each one. Why? Because if they gain control of all these powers, they can resurrect the dead under their control all over the world. Think about it. Hundreds of thousands of dead acting under his command. What army could stand against such power?" Ezekiel's blood froze. This is impossible." "No, it's possible. And now that Blackmore is dead, others will come in his place. This brotherhood is large, and they won't give up." Isabella turned to Ezekiel. "That's why you need us, and we need you too, because there are very few people who carry these powers, and you are one of them." "Mary. Where is Mary now?" Isabella smiled. "Look around you, Mr. Thornton. She's always been here. You just needed to learn to see her." Ezekiel looked around, and then he saw her. Among the tombstones, a familiar silhouette, Mary, smiling and waving at him. But this wasn't goodbye. This was a new beginning. Because now Ezekiel knew. Mary had always been with him. He just didn't know how to see her. "Mary," he whispered. Mary's spirit approached him. Now he could talk to her. "Ezekiel, forgive me. I couldn't tell you what was happening. But now I'll always be with you. You're not alone in this journey." Tears flowed from Ezekiel's eyes, but this time not from pain, but from happiness. After 12 years, he could talk to Mary again. The next morning, when the sun rose, Ezekiel was preparing to say goodbye to Thunder Gap Graveyard. But this time, he wasn't alone. Isabella and her sisters were with him. Mary's spirit too, and the other spirits from the graveyard too. "Will they come too?" Ezekiel asked, looking at the spirits around them. "Some will come," said Isabella, "especially Mary. She's your guardian now. But the others, they'll stay here. They'll continue to protect this graveyard." Ezekiel looked one last time at his home of 12 years. The small church cottage, peaceful and calm. But it wasn't his home anymore. His home was now beside Mary. And Mary would always be with him. "Where's our first stop?" he asked. "Nevada," said Isabella. "There's an abandoned gold mine there. A place called Silver Ridge. Strange reports are coming from there too. Miners have disappeared. And at night, sounds come from the depths of the mine." "What kind of sounds?" "The sounds of the dead. Because that mine wasn't just dug to extract gold. There are other things there. Old graves, Indian sacred places. And when these are disturbed..." Isabella fell silent, looking thoughtfully into the distance. "What happened?" Ezekiel asked curiously. "What happened at Silver Ridge might be much more dangerous than what happened at Thunder Gap. Because there aren't just dead there. There are things that never died." This statement made Ezekiel shiver. Things that never died? Ancient powers. Powers that existed before the earth. Awakening them. This could be very dangerous. Mary's spirit came to Ezekiel's side. "Don't be afraid," she said in a soft voice. "You're not alone anymore. And this power will be used for good." Ezekiel smiled. For the first time in 12 years, he was truly smiling. Because now he had a purpose. Now he had work to do. And most importantly, Now he was together with Mary. As they mounted their horses, the spirits in the graveyard bid them farewell. Each one wished Ezekiel good luck, and Mary's grave glowed one last time, as if saying goodbye. "We'll come back," Ezekiel said, looking at the graveyard. "One day we'll come back." "Yes," said Isabella, "but when that day comes, you won't be the same person anymore. You'll be much stronger. And Mary will be stronger with you too." As their horses galloped away, Ezekiel looked back. Thunder Gap Graveyard was getting smaller, but his heart was growing, because now he knew this was just a beginning. Great adventures, great struggles lay ahead. But he wasn't afraid, because Mary was with him. And as Isabella had said, love is stronger than death. But this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. Because Isabella had mentioned other places, they were also in danger, and Ezekiel had much to learn. Years later, travelers would tell stories of the night when a graveyard keeper and 5 mysterious women stood against an army and won. But those who lived it knew the truth was simpler and more complex. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong, but between staying safe and staying human. And sometimes when the choice matters most, being human is the only thing that really counts. The story had ended with a message. Sometimes the greatest losses we experience lead us to the greatest powers. Sometimes the deepest pains turn into the greatest loves. And sometimes even death cannot break true bonds. Ezekiel Thornton lived with the dead for 12 years. But that night he began to live. And Mary knew she would protect him forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because Ezekiel's journey was just beginning. Isabella had told him there were many such places in the world, and in each one, forces like the Black Hand Brotherhood were trying to disrupt the sacred balance. Their next stop was Nevada, at an abandoned gold mine. Strange things were happening there too. Miners were disappearing, and at night, sounds came from the depths of the mine. But that's another story, another struggle, and another victory. Because Ezekiel Thornton was no longer just a lonely graveyard keeper. He was a warrior between 2 worlds, and Mary's spirit would protect him forever. If you liked this story, write to me in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Ezekiel's place? Would you have opened the door, or would you have continued your 12 years of solitude? Because sometimes life's hardest decisions are about whether to open the door or not. And sometimes, opening the door changes your entire life. Ezekiel's story ends here. But the real story might just be beginning now. Because each of us has silent voices knocking at our door. The question is, are we brave enough to hear them? And are we strong enough to open the door to them? Ezekiel Thornton's story shows that this is possible. You can make it possible too. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel to join the Westbound Epic Stories family. Because the best stories are still waiting to be told. And in the next story, we'll see Ezekiel's adventures in Nevada. But that story holds even bigger secrets, bigger dangers, and bigger victories. So don't forget to subscribe, because you don't want to miss the greatest stories of the Wild West. See you soon, cowboys. And remember, sometimes the greatest adventures begin with listening to those who knock at your door.